So today I'm interviewing Sonay and we're just gonna ask her a few questions, and she'll just answer them for us. So to start, Sonay, just tell me about yourself and where you and your family are from.
Yeah, so I'm a college student, but my family, and I live in the United States right now. I attend Rutgers University, but my parents and my heritage are from Iran. We come from a city called Tabriz, which is in the north, like 9 hours from Tehran, which is the capital. And I grew up spending a lot of time in Iran, whether that be, like actually in the country or sort of in a bubble within the US among Iranian family friends and other Iranian kids. So I would say it's a big part of who I am today and my experience living in the US. Because I don't necessarily feel a part of the like homogenous white population, and I also don't feel like necessarily totally Iranian when I'm in Iran. So it's sort of this like weird place in between.
So you just feel like you blend in better over there than here, like.
I would
Okay.
say, I mean, there I have less explaining to do to people. Here it's constantly, as soon as people figure out what my name is, it's sort of, I have to spend a lot of time explaining
Yeah.
myself, and there's always the question of, well, where are you really from? So, I mean, there that's not really a question. But I wouldn't necessarily say, I feel also that there I have to explain myself to people and say, like I'm not a typical American, I'm not a colonialist or whatever, an imperialist.
But you probably still have to explain that you're like from America and all that stuff,
Mhm.
because I have to do the same thing when I go back to Vietnam and visit
Mhm.
my family, friends, and all that stuff. So.
Yeah, it's sort of, in both places you're an outsider a little bit.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
completely understand.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to conclude that question. We'll go continue the next. Do you have any stories of or anything you want to tell us about maybe how or why your parents
Mhm.
migrated over here?
So my father left Iran a little bit before the revolution because he wanted to get an education elsewhere, and he had already studied in Iran for a few years as an undergraduate, but he wanted, a sort of, he's an engineer, and he wanted better options because at the time it wasn't too great over there. And obviously the revolution was beginning, and my family is Azerbaijani in Iran, which means that we're sort of sidelined and marginalized by whichever government is in power. So my dad had always sort of wanted to leave for a number of reasons, but mostly that sort of marginalization because of our ethnic identity. So he looked for educational opportunities abroad, and he actually always tells us he was going to get his visa and his papers from the American embassy in Tehran while people were protesting right outside of it. So it's sort of this convenient time for him to leave because what happened afterwards has created Iran today, and he would have had a much harder time leaving at that point. And then my mom met him, or they knew each other kind of, and their families knew each other a little bit. And she was younger than him, and they sort of decided to start meeting up when he was living in France. They would meet in Turkey, and they decided to get married. And then she just sort of picked up and went to France. She was an art student, so it made sense for her to go as well. And then a few countries later, they ended up in the U.S. and where we are now.
Okay, so I just have a few questions. One,
Mhm.
what kind of engineer was your father?
He's an electrical engineer, so he works mostly on software and a little bit of hardware.
Okay, and what kind of art was your mother into?
She is she did visual art, so she studied fine arts in school and really wanted to go into architecture, but there's actually a great field for women in architecture in Iran, but unfortunately, I think, well, it is fact that when she came here, her degrees weren't really valid by American universities, so she sort of had to start all over again in terms of her studies, and it sort of, it felt patronizing for her. It felt like everything she had worked for was just deemed illegitimate in the U.S., even though like there are very similar standards of study in both. So yeah, it was sort of like a steep learning curve for my mom, especially engineering, because my dad was able to get his education in France, or his graduate education. He kind of had access to certain things, but you know, there's this idea that an Iranian education or Middle Eastern education isn't valid, like for certain studies, and my mom had to learn the reality of that.
Thank you for that. We're going to move on to the next one. So, what are your opinions and thoughts on pre-modern and modern Middle East before France and the Europeans modernized the Middle East?
I think it's an interesting question, because Iran, I mean, this idea of modern is sort of totally subject to whatever power, whoever is in power, and to making that decision of what is modernity. I mean, there are certain things that were in Iran that are more modern, like, you know, like the experience of being, for example, queer in Iran, post or pre-modern, was much more progressive than even like certain Western standards of it. So, I mean, that's just a quick note on the pre-modern, modern terminology. But I would say Iran before modernity, by like the Western definition of it. I mean, like, obviously I can't speak to the total reality of it because I wasn't there. Most people weren't there.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, Iran is capable of making its own government structures and political realities, and I don't think that enough countries will give the credit for that, especially the U.S. I mean, most people know about Mossadegh and his democratic election and the fact that he was trying to bring about an Iran that did have democratic structures and nationalized resource and industries like the oil industry. And like these ideas of modernity, including like women's access to certain like political structures, or like healthcare and things like that. Those are all things that are considered modern values that Mossadegh advocated for, and that the U.S. actively stifled through the coup. So, I mean, there's definitely a lot of hypocritical sort of understanding of the Middle East, and that whatever structures they independently create, whether those be democratic structures or social structures, ideas of feminism or whatever, all of those are just supposedly not modern by Western standards, and that's not necessarily fair. I think modernity can come about without Western involvement and without traditional Western ideas of development, and yet here we are, and modernity is consistently defined by the Western colonial interpretation. So I would say that Iran, honestly, especially due to its anti-colonial sentiments, has been able to resist that sort of that idea of modernization by Western standards. But living in the West, I see it all the time, and it's sort of like they're able to ignore it a bit because they can be isolated from the U.S., but living here, it's impossible to not see it.
So,
Mm-hmm.
all right, well, thank you for your time, Sonay. I
Yep.
really appreciate it. You're the best.